Good evening and welcome to the final in our Practising Synodality Webinar Series. My name's Avril Bagent and I'm co-director of the School for Synodality, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Anna Rowlands to be with us in our last session this evening. Good evening, Anna.
Good evening.
Anna is a professor at the University of Durham. She's also part of the Secretariat for the Synod in the Vatican, and has been dividing her time in a crazy way almost between the two places, and so brings a huge amount of reflection to us tonight, both in her own research work as a political theologian and in her working practice with the Synod office. And she was part of the Fratelli group, writing the document for the continental stage, Enlarge the Space of our tents, and also part of the working group for the Synod and one of the experts at the Synod. So we're looking forward to a fascinating conversation tonight. And over the last few weeks, I was just reflecting, really coming back from September, we've had all kinds of people in conversation with us, and we've explored some practices of synodality in the UK and then around the world. So Anna, I'm wondering if we could start off tonight by asking, what is your own experience of synodality? We've asked everybody this, and everybody's kind of had a different experience. And I want to particularly ask about some of the listening practices you've used in your academic work.
Yeah, so I'm almost a slightly accidental participant in the big sort of universal stage process of the Synod. I was busily working away on other things when I got a request to talk to the Secretariat about becoming involved. And one of the first things I said to them was, I'm not an ecclesiologist. So I'm the wrong person. You absolutely don't want me working on this because I'm not a properly trained ecclesiologist. And they said, look, we've got loads of ecclesiologists. That isn't actually why we're asking you. And I realized that, in fact, one of the reasons that they were asking me is because one of the things I have tried to do in the last sort of decade and a half in my own theological work is to try and work out the connections between lived experience, between people's realities and their practices, and the way in which theology is done, and the way in which we think about presenting the claims of the church. So in that sense, I was quite used to doing quite steadily disciplined listening in some fairly challenging contexts in which there wasn't easy agreement on a particular issue, and then trying to do theology from that interface of disciplined listening. So I suppose I ended up being sort of almost dragged away from other things into working on the Synod process, precisely because I had been attempting to do theological work that was about what do you do with the complexity and messiness of human reality as it presents itself, and how do you engage that in terms of thinking about communicating the deposit of the faith and thinking about kind of the ongoing development of doctrine in the tradition in that light. And I hadn't been working on hot button issues in terms of morality that lots of people associated as being sort of, you know, the neuralgic or hot button issues of the Synod. I'd in fact been working mainly on a range of sort of social and ethical issues rather than sort of moral issues. I don't like that distinction, but broadly speaking, I'd been working on quite a different set of issues to the ones that the Synod was then developing an interest in. So that was helpful for me because it was enabling me to do something that I did in the rest of my work, but in quite a new way, and with this extraordinary range of voices, the chance to be involved in listening to people from every corner of the globe who were reflecting what it meant in their everyday life to be Catholics, what they hoped for and longed for from the church, and where they found God in their own experiences. That being able to listen to that everywhere from, Alaska to Eritrea to the US to Russia, that's a really extraordinarily privileged thing to be able to sit with those reflections, and people poured themselves into those Synod conversations and processes in a way that is just unbelievably rich, and we're nowhere near mining the richness of what came up at the grassroots stage, let alone the way in which then the continental phase and October then built on that.
Well, I think one of the really interesting questions about the Synod listening so far has been, how do you deal with the complexity of it? How do you go from, well, that was a nice conversation, to actually reflecting on it further and, sort of reflecting on it theologically, reflecting on it in terms of moving to action. So what are there lessons that you learned from your research that you could be helpful to people when thinking about that? I'm just throwing you that question. Oh, that was not one of our agreed questions. So I've just thrown it out as a
No, sure.
response.
I'd actually start from somewhere else in thinking about where the deepest learning is from the method that's been used by the early stages of the Synod. So using what we call conversation in the spirit methodology. One of the things that was said to me by a bishop who found in an African context, he found himself really surprised by how transformative engaging with the listening process of methodology of the early stage had been. He basically said to me that it operated in his diocese like a kind of de-weaponization program, meaning that people had come into the room with a real sense that they had their position, they were going to state it, and one side or another was going to come out victorious, and they were there to make sure that their version of the truth was victorious. And he said that he just found it extraordinary to see that the process of beginning with the word of God, so beginning with listening to the scriptures, everybody having an equal chance. So it's not a table with somebody at the head of it, but rather it's a round table kind of experience in which everybody has the same amount of time to speak. Everybody has a chance to contribute and to reflect. And then the use of silence and the use of scripture, sharing of experience, silence, and then response, and then silence. That in itself was transformative of the way that people experience themselves in relationship to others. And that process, that same process of transformation and overcoming, not that everybody agrees by the end of it, but there's a way of living sort of diversity and unity through the method that actually is really significant and valuable. People who experience that at the most local level, the same thing happened in October. And somebody said to me, and I think I will always remember this because I think there's a really profound ordinary truth in it. And he said, because I would listen to people as they went round in the group, and each person would have their few minutes to speak. And he said, under normal circumstances, when I heard somebody say something that I thought was maybe a bit irritating or wrong or a bit idiotic or misconceived, I immediately would think, right, I don't agree with that. So, but he said, by the time everybody had gone round, it had been punctuated with silence, and you came back to speak again, you realised that although you disagreed with people on one thing, actually there were other aspects of what they'd said that you agreed with, and you were given time to digest and reflect on that. And by the time you came to speak, you responded yourself in a different way because of the way that speech and silence had been held together. So I think it's less the data that can be drawn out and how you analyze that. It's much more what's happening in the process when it's done with integrity, and the way in which that works on us in a way which is transformative within both local communities, but also can be transformative at that level of talking at the level of the universal church as we were in October. So that bit, there's loads of interesting data stuff, if you like, and how do you deal with very contradictory findings. That's the cerebral part of my brain is interested in that. But actually there's something much more important in terms of the times we live in right now, church-wise and societally. There's something much more important in what the method enables us to be and do as community. And that's the richness, that's the real value of the process, I think.
We had a couple of occasions in our diocese where people came in with an agenda. They came in with like a manifesto to read out. And just as you say, they kind of got into that process and they put it down. They just literally put it on the floor and said, no, this is not the place. And bless them, actually, it was about the fact that the Holy Spirit has not been paid attention to in the church. And their manifesto was that we ought to be paying attention to the Holy Spirit. And actually there we were all paying attention to the Holy Spirit. But it does have that kind of, no, it's not calming because it's not about being in a different emotion, but it is about the depth of the listening, isn't it? And the openness, which is different, I think.
And a work that is happening in you as you listen. So it's almost what's happening in the space in between you and another, and the way in which that becomes a deeply, deeply transformative process spiritually. And that's hugely important, I think, to a possibility of a church that's less divided, less fractured, less fractious, more able to bear with one another, and more able to form something that looks more genuinely like the life of the Gospels, really.
It was really interesting. Even already, you've spoken about that kind of global aspect. This African bishop said, hearing from different voices. You were part of the Frascati group, as I said, that kind of came together. Didn't you read all the documents from across the world or something crazy? So I wonder what really struck you as part of the global church, because we're so sort of in a little UK bubble here. What would you not have known about the church had you not had that kind of opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't this again can sound a bit banal, but it was absolutely extraordinary to read these snapshots of Catholicism and people's experience from all over the globe. And some of the reports that will stay with me for the longest, I think, were the Ethiopian report, the South African report, some of the Eastern European reports, and they had this capacity to show a reality that's truly global and yet is utterly sort of rooted in the soil of the individual place and locality, so that you could see something generational, something of the moment we are living in and struggling to be human in and struggling to reach towards the divine in. And I think there are two or three things for me that run across those contexts, and I'll say very briefly what they are in a moment. But the sort of lead into that is, before I went into reading the Frascati documents, I was in Rome for a series of meetings, and a couple of journalists had said to me, "Oh, what are you here to do?" And I'd said, "Oh, we're beginning to read these documents from all over the world." And they said, "Well, I don't know why you're bothering to read them, because it's really obvious what you'll find. You'll find a church that's divided between global north and global south. You'll find that the global south basically is just kind of wants a particular set of morally conservative agendas protected, and the global north wants to change all of that. And so it'll all come down to a fight about gender and sexuality. And, basically it will be a really kind of hopeless process. So all you're going to find is this kind of polarization between global north and global south." That is absolutely not what those reports show at all. They show a church which actually is concerned with, how do you live genuine diversity in unity? So how do you genuinely deal with the fact that most of our churches now are composed out of very often migrant communities alongside more settled long-term communities? How do you integrate those communities in different settings? How do you genuinely accompany people in very diverse life situations, and do that not just accompanying people as individuals, but actually how do you accompany whole family units? How do you accompany in an intergenerational way? So some of the Asian reports are really profound in talking about that need to accompany families as domestic church, not just thinking about a more Western therapeutic model of almost spiritual counsel and pastoral care simply for individuals. Across context, there's a massive concern for the quality of liturgy, for the way in which liturgy is able to be both beautiful and genuinely raise the soul in praise to God, but also to make real connections with people's everyday lives. So one of the universals across context was preaching and the quality of homiletics and preaching, how well priests are perhaps prepared through the seminary system for the realities of their ministry in the world as it is at the moment, and also a deep desire for a kind of ongoing process of theological learning across a lifetime of really being able to mature and connect the really challenging experiences that we can have in our lives, whether it's our work lives, our family lives, etc., with the extraordinary richness of our faith tradition, and almost a sense of being quite let down that the church is not providing for that kind of necessary integration and connection. So those are questions that emerge across context. Equally, questions of the abuse of power, and that comes up with slightly different inflections in different contexts. So for some people, that's very much about the sexual abuse crisis and the impact of that. For other people, it's about corruption around money, or simply abusive, as in power abusive behavior. So kind of spiritual abuse in the context of power. So those issues are raised constantly as a block to integrity, to the church being whole and holy. In different settings. So those are there. And then the final thing that was really striking, which was a common theme but had different inflections and different contexts, was about one ethnic group over another, so forms of tribalism, that affect the church, or in other contexts, actually, forms of kind of class differentiation that effectively mean that certain classes of people were considered not really to be welcome, were not listened to, their voices not heard, they're not seen as privileged contributors, they're not seen as people who should be heard and listened to with real respect in parish life and seen as real decision makers and decision takers. So issues of kind of ethnocentrism, issues of class, issues of tribalism, all of those were echoed. They just had slightly different inflections to them, but they clearly were a related pattern across contexts. And the way in which the gospel forces us to confront those and see those divisions and hierarchies as really antithetical to the message of Christ, that, you know, those things very much were raised across contexts in a way that I found really interesting. So much richness and such an extraordinary portrait of our collective Catholic moment in those reports. Yeah.
One of the things which really stood out to me from reading the document, the Enlarge the Space of Your Tent, was a comment from Haiti, which said, you know, despite extreme violence, we managed to hold listening sessions. And I thought, and we were complaining about the fact that we were in, you know, in January and it was dark and cold and there was a COVID wave going on, you know, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's such sacrifice in some parts of the church just to even, you know, make it to a listening session. I don't think we really have a concept of ourselves as a global church, as in not just a universal church, but the difference of being Catholic all around the world that just started to bring out.
Yeah, and that, I mean, one of the things that was really moving were reading the reports and the testimonies from what we might call the suffering church and the persecuted church in different settings. Sometimes the suffering church simply because of conditions of war, sometimes because of active persecution of Christians, and the efforts that people had gone to engage with the synod listening process. You know, they were profoundly moving. The last report to come in, pretty much just beyond time, but obviously was included, was the Russian report. And that was a report that couldn't be made public for very obvious reasons. And you realized when you read some of those reports that can never be made public, but that we read the extraordinary power of those testimonies and the desperate realities that are faced by many of our fellow Catholics across the globe. Hopefully, I hope one day that all of that material will be made public in some form, because it is an extraordinary witness, testimony, and resource for ongoing reflection. At the moment, some bishops' conferences have made those available, and I would really encourage people who are maybe just beginning to engage with the synod process, or who are wanting to find creative ways to deepen that engagement, maybe to take a report that is available through the Synod website and read a report from a completely different part of the world that maybe you know nothing about. You know, read the Ethiopian report. It's really extraordinary. Read the South African report and think about contexts that really, you know, we're deeply connected to, and yet also maybe we don't know so much about. And I think there's a huge enrichment even in just doing that level of encounter. And so much of Pope Francis's message is precisely about learning the art of encounter, learning the art of attention. To whom will you give your attention? Who are you willing to encounter? Who do you see as your brother and sister? And the synod process is his own internal church version of what he says to the world, to the political world and the social world.
I think that's a great idea, and Anna, we'll try and do, if we can find the links to those, we'll put them we'll put them up with the video and send them out to people. I just want to say to people, if you're watching this live and you have a question for Anna, then do stick it in the chat, because we'll have some time. In about 20 minutes time, we'll turn to questions if we've got any. So Anna, give us a little flavour of what it was like to be at the synod. You were in a very particular position, weren't you, as an expert? So we've heard from in the series so far, a participant who was the only Western permanent deacon. So that was really fascinating to hear his experience. And we heard from Maurizio, who was running the facilitator group. And so, but you were there as an expert. So give us a flavour of what that was like.
So, well, the honest answer to this is that probably the group that was least well integrated into the synod. This is the honest, warts and all version of it. The group that was least well integrated into the synod were the experts. And actually, I think this is really quite revealing, because it's a bit like the church doesn't really know what to do with theologians. And at times it's a bit like theologians don't quite know what to do with the kind of rest of the church. And my feeling is at the moment that there's almost a kind of gap between the life of theologians and the life of bishops, sometimes also between the life of theologians and the life of many laity. And I don't mean that in the sense of a sort of blame narrative, but I think there is and there remains a gap there that actually is really significant and important. And so I think that they're in trying to come up with a new method for being synodal. So not looking like the synods that have happened before, but sitting around round tables, having a completely open agenda, not having a document that was drafted in advance and was there just to be amended and rubber stamped, but having a completely open-ended process. There was this dilemma about how theologians, experts, would be included in that dynamic. And I think actually there is a necessary refining and gradual learning about how to do that. So I think you've already heard from somebody who was a voting member, so from Hertz, I presume, you were listening to, and he will have had a profound experience of sitting around those tables, listening to others, going away moved by the testimonies that he had heard. And equally, Maurizio, as a facilitator, was in charge of holding together those small group processes and of steering and guiding those and ensuring that the method was used properly. And he, again, had a really privileged role in being able to hear much of what was going on. For the experts, their position was a little bit different because they were listening at almost another stage removed. So they were in the room listening to the plenary discussions, but quite deliberately, and this was a controversial move, they were not part of the round tables, the small group discussions. So the experts would pore over the reports that were written by the small groups, by the secretary of each small group that was elected by each small group, so not a person imposed on the group. So the experts would pore over the small group reports and they would help spot divergences, convergences, matters that could be deepened, where there were deep connections with the wider theological tradition that maybe the group was or wasn't aware of. And they would try and do that work of interpretation as another layer of discussion and reflection that could be fed into the process. But I think in a way that was also a slightly unsatisfactory experience for many of those who were there as experts, because they desperately wanted to be having the same experience as your deacon had and as Maurizio had around the tables. So I think in a way that question of what is the role of an expert, I mean, it's a silly word in a way, because really it just meant people who are trained theologians. But what's the role of theologians in supporting synodality? That's a really important, ongoing, not fully answered and contested question. And that actually relates to the bigger level, the more meta level question, which is what's the role of theology in the process? And that, I think, again, is evolving as we sort of find a new way, especially with having lay people and bishops in that process together. This is an evolving learning process. And as an expert, I'd say that we're still very much on that path of working out how theologians fit in and what the place of theology is in that process. So, I mean, I'm happy to answer more questions on what it was like on a more day-to-day basis, but actually I think it's the one bit of the process that didn't work so well.
And that's, that's the learning, isn't it? That was kind of the first time we'd done a synod in that way, and even the first assembly of the pair of assemblies. So you will presumably get another bite of the cherry coming around in October. But I think that question of how theology relates to the synod is a really interesting one. And that, I think I was kind of groping after it earlier, in that, how does the reflection that goes on even in a parish conversation, then how does that then relate and in an interesting way, in a complex way, to the tradition of the church, and how is it informing that going forward? How is the conversation itself informed by our theological tradition? How it is a complicated relationship, that, isn't it?
It is. And the other thing that's happening in the room is that that conversation has been dominated by Western European theologians in the past. So there is also a process of kind of the decentering of that more Western and European theological approach, both in terms of sort of almost the way it's conducted, as well as some of the issues that are presented as the central issues. So we're learning how to do that theological process in a more genuinely intercultural and global way at the same time as well. So there's multiple levels to how that learning is happening. In a sense, I think that one of the things that Pope Francis has wanted is that some of the themes would emerge from the pastoral reality of the church. And we know he's a reality over ideas person. Personally, I don't quite see them as I think you have to be very careful about how you present the reality or ideas thing, because I don't think it's binary in that way. And I don't quite think the Pope does, but nonetheless, he's interested in the discerning of the realities that present themselves, and theologians not rushing in to smooth things over or to suppress, difficult questions. So the question is then how he sees theology as fitting in that process. And I think almost what he's wanted theologians to do is to attend, to listen, to wait on the movement of the Spirit, and for theology to serve that process. So what does it mean for theology to be in service to the people of God? And that means that, in a way, the moment we're entering into now in the Synod, I think, is massively important for thinking about the contribution of theology and theologians. There are now a set of issues, there are now a set of human realities that are presenting themselves very insistently to us across context. Some are very clearly, there are some questions and realities that belong very clearly to one or two particular contexts, but there are many that are presenting themselves as a general reality that we're living within our times across contexts. And the question now is how theology and theologians will serve the deepening of that process and the interpretation of that. And I think in the next month or so, the Pope's going to give some guidance, I think, on how theologians will work, and canonists as well, because many of the questions that the Synod is dealing with are really also canonical questions, and it's a question about the development of and service of canon law as well. So I think those questions will become clearer to us, how Pope Francis sees theology serving that process in the next month or so. And Pope Francis has been well known for the odd quip about not always finding theologians like me so helpful. He's quite a tough taskmaster in terms of him thinking about how theology can serve processes like this.
And coming out of the assembly, then I think one of the things was that people weren't sure what to expect. And so when the synthesis report came out, I remember sitting and reading it, and I read it quickly once, and then I got home from a meeting and I got myself a glass of sloe gin, and I sat down. I thought, right, I'm going to really process this, and read it a second time kind of slowly. And I at the same time, I was thinking, gosh, it's a very technical document. Like if you were just reading it as an ordinary person in the pew whose expertise was elsewhere, you wouldn't necessarily know, how significant some of this stuff was. But at the same time, I was reading it go, oh my gosh, we're just going to reform seminary training. We're just going to reform canon law. We're just going to, sort of think about women deacons. And so there was a very odd disconnect between quite a sort of straight-laced way of writing, a technical way of writing. And I felt like I kind of almost needed like a voiceover in my head from a canon lawyer to say, oh, this is, this bit is really important, flashing lights here. But I wondered how what you felt about the document as it came out, and what are some of the big challenges for the global church, but particularly, for the UK church. We had people emailing to the schools for synodality saying, what do we do with this? How do we even process it? And so I think people were also looking for a big picture vision, which isn't necessarily there at the moment, but they were also looking for some kind of takeaways for their own communities, sort of for now, really.
Yeah. So one of the first things I would say, having been involved in the process of the Synod, is to think about what place that document had within the process as a whole. So thinking about the method of the Synod. The reality is that, as I was saying before, in previous synods, very often a document has been written, at least in draft form, in advance. And what happens is there's a refining process through the discussion. And then there's a document that people can kind of vote on or broadly consent to at the end of it. And very consciously, Pope Francis did not want this synod to work in that way. So there was no pre-prepared document, and much of the sort of more cynical press coverage beforehand was that secretly there was one. Nobody believed that there wasn't a document beforehand. There really was no document beforehand. Now that has both strengths and weaknesses. The strength of that is that what's written truly emerges from the process. The weakness of that is that a document is being written as people are trying to form a mind in a room in a really complex, in a very short time frame, relatively speaking, for producing a document that can speak to the whole church, and where that's emerging iteratively, kind of section by section, as people are discussing. Now, so that's one thing to bear in mind, is that this is almost simply a capturing and a representation of the discussion that happened. If you've got much more time, you can produce a document that's perhaps more considered, more polished, more motivational. But actually, this was an act of kind of capturing what was happening and trying to understand what was unfolding in the room. So understanding the very method of the synod and how the process of the synod relates to that final document is quite important. And it's not a final document of the Synod on Synodality. It's an interim synthesis report. So it synthesizes the discussion that was had amongst that group of people. Now, the second thing to bear in mind is that the decision to have a kind of media blackout on reporting the more detailed conversations, who said what was discussed on the floor, means that there wasn't a kind of evolving sense of a kind of sharing of some of the more kind of profound testimonies on a day-by-day basis as we were going through. So Massimo Fagioli talks about, the synod as ending up a bit like a sort of silent movie. And there's a kind of truth in that. And again, we can debate the strengths and weaknesses to that kind of decision around coverage and people's access. But it means that a huge amount of focus fell on the synthesis report because people knew less about what was happening on a day-to-day basis and some of the dynamics of that. So because it's a synthesis document, because it's capturing as things are moving along quite quickly in a short period of time, and because everything sort of ended up focusing a bit on that, I think that means that almost too much emphasis is put on, pressure is put on trying to kind of dissect the synthesis report. It's one part and it's an interim part of this whole. So I think it's helpful to see it in those terms, or at least I find it helpful to think about the synthesis report in those terms. Somebody in the synod process, in fact, a couple of people did say that they felt that the synthesis report had described very well what happened in the room, and that it was a very fair and balanced representation of those discussions, but they didn't necessarily feel massively motivated by it. So there's a difference between it being a very good description, a very good act of capture, but not necessarily a piece of kind of deeply moving spiritual proclamation to the rest of the church. So, and that's not, I think that's not an unfair comment, and that comment was made by a small number of people there. But again, I think there's a process of learning how a report can serve that synod process. So that's just a bit of contextualizing that actually I think can be quite helpful for people then thinking about how they approach reading it. It's capture, it's synthesis, it's an attempt to note down where there were genuine convergences. Where did we know that we genuinely agreed on something? And that there was a common perception of that reality? Where were there obvious and honest divergences that we couldn't fix in the room, but could be better understood, and where we could find language to capture those divergences and hold those tensions in prayer as a kind of common reality of the church? And where were there clear, and the Italian phrase is rather nicer than the English one, in Italian, passi in avanti, steps forward, where were there concrete forms of steps forward that could be taken that didn't actually necessitate waiting till next year, that could be done now and embraced now? So there was a sense sense of genuinely walking this road together and not just sort of waiting for this one moment. So the synthesis report is an attempt to capture those genuine convergences across a global context. That's a remarkable thing in itself, to approach the synthesis report and think, what can we genuinely say together? Secondly, where are there differences that don't necessarily mean we have to be at each other's throats, but genuinely we have to learn what we do with these tensions and divergences and differences, and where are the things that we can do right now? And for that, I think the synthesis report has value, but it has all of those other complexities and light and shade that I was alluding to before, given its kind of place within the overall process and method.
I find that enormously helpful, actually. I don't think I'd quite processed that the convergences were the kind of the agreement, the place to stand, and then the divergences were where more conversation was. I mean, it's obvious when you say it, but just the way you express that, I think that's very helpful for people to go and say, okay, I mean, it's almost like an accounting of our place right now, isn't it? Okay, here is where we are. This is the global church agreeing on some stuff, including that synodality needs a bit more work, but it appears to be a good way of doing things. And here is some stuff that we don't really agree on, or that we can't get a single voice on, but that we're holding in disagreement. And that's okay as well. I mean, it's bold. It's quite brave, really, to lay it out. Here are all the places that we don't agree with one another. But I think that's
or that we don't yet have a common understanding, that we don't yet have a common divergence. So it almost doesn't even need to be always seen as just an outright disagreement. I disagree with you, full stop. Where do we go from here? But this sense that there are divergent perceptions, there can be a common reality seen in very different ways, that we're in search of, we're yearning for a more truly common understanding of that reality, or a shared way forward. And so I think the divergences includes things that might be considered an outright disagreement, but also things that we're simply struggling towards understanding better, that we're grappling with. And we live in a world that is so fast paced, that is moving with such extraordinary speed, that being able to stop and capture and really understand some of what's happening to us, some of what we are doing to ourselves, to the world around us, to our relationship with our Creator, that takes time, attention, understanding, and we don't have very much of that. We live in an impatient, constantly shifting and moving reality. And the Synod, in a way, is partly a way of slowing down, of paying attention. And one of the really interesting things was hearing bishops say at the end of each, well, not just bishops, but participants say at the end of each day, I'm absolutely exhausted. Listening to people is so tiring. I mean, I slightly want to say, I don't know what you've been doing the rest of your time, but this is sort of what we're supposed to do in part. But the reality is that really giving your attention to somebody else or another reality, as in the reality of the world, is something which is hugely spiritually draining. And it's no wonder that we constantly distract ourselves with other activities to prevent the costliness of that slowness being clear. And the Synod did train us in that as something of a spiritual discipline. And I think it has enormous cultural value in our moment.
So just to follow that up then, Anna, I mean, for the UK Church, for people watching I can just see some of the comments from the names. I know that there are people out there who are just wanting to get on with it. What would be some things that you would think would be key for us to be focusing in on as a result of where we are right now?
So I think there are loads of things already in the synthesis report that people can get on with at a more localized level. One of the brilliant things about the New Zealand report, by the way, if people think about reading reports, just the one from the New Zealand Area Episcopal Conference, is they had a list of things that they had discerned from their local listening that they could already get on with, that they did not need to wait for Rome to give them permission to do, but they knew. So one of the key things across context, and I thought this would be something close to your own heart, is about a preferential option for the young. It's about what can be done right now to support family units, to support intergenerational faith development, and to support an option for young people. No one needs Rome. We've already had a synod on that. Nobody nobody needs Rome to give permission to do much of what could be done right now for more effective mission and evangelization work and pastoral support, spiritual accompaniment for family units and for young people. So anyway, New Zealand had a list of these are the things that we've discerned that we could just get on with doing now. And then they had a list of things that pertain to the level of the universal and require discernment at the level of the universal church and where they needed to wait on that process. And I almost think any context could read the synthesis report, the Frascati document, or just not do any of that and begin with the conversation in the spirit method and discern things that can be done together as parish groups, as lay movements, etc., that could be done right now and don't require permission from some or a decision from some higher level body to get on with. Nonetheless, there are things which are urgent, which do require discernment at the level of the universal church and are no less urgent. And those things we need a collective endeavour at every single level. One of the things that the letter that was issued just before Christmas from the Synod office, one of the things that makes clear is they want to go back to the level of the diocese, and they want every diocese to have quite a simple process, but one that involves all the elements of the church. They want lay movements, they want parish priests, they want bishops, they want theologians and local dioceses to work together on the issues that are presented and the realities that are there in the synthesis report. That ability to even model that in a diocese, how well at the moment do our dioceses really manage to do that pastoral planning, that listening, that shared decision making and decision taking that involves all of those actors? How well do bishops and theologians work together at the most local level? How are those responsible for leadership and lay ministry involved actively in the kind of more meta level discernments and so forth? So, you know, all of that is a reality. Equally, a key part of the Pope Francis of the Synod was thinking about the peripheries and about the involvement of those who are most on the social margins of our local neighbourhoods, our parishes and so forth. The ability to work on integrating to making sure that we're really attending to the realities of the margins, not just in terms of the needs of the margins, but the way in which God is present and should be listened to, the ministry of the poorest to us, that is a key challenge. Nobody needs Rome to do anything in order to be able to more vibrantly, more truly, more beautifully, and more honestly live out many of those realities. So yes, there's key things that are already there in the Frascati document, in the Instrumentum Laboris, in the synthesis document, and in the most recent letter. But even just an honest synodal process engaged with at the most local level will produce actions that do not need to wait for next year and can happen now.
Absolutely. I keep on telling people in our diocese we need to stop waiting for the man from Rome to ride in on a white horse. Do you know, like we're good to go in so many things. And sometimes I think, although the big issues are very, very heartfelt, sometimes it's easier to focus on that than to fix our community life, because fixing our community life is really hard and personal and it's a lot of work. And I think, yeah, I think there's a lot that we can be getting on with. And I'm going to jump to the questions because we've had loads of questions running in, and I've been not looking at them because I've been concentrating on what you've been saying. Yeah, you have a glass of water while I read this. That's a good plan. Frank Callis is asking, would it be fair to say that the most impactful element of synodality is what happens at the level of the parish? I think you've kind of been hinting at that already.
Yes, although I think that there are really important questions that have come up through the synod process about what episcopal conferences are for and what their function is. So how do they serve? So if we think about kind of subsidiarity and that the higher levels are all there for the service of the most kind of, you know, the local Eucharistic community, etc. I think that there are important questions that exist at the level which is not simply the parish, but is about the service of that. And actually, bishops want to think about, for example, their own role and their own ministries. And there are important questions. There are big tensions that have emerged for bishops in the exercise of their own ministry over things that have come to light through things like the sexual abuse crisis and so forth, the tension between the kind of fatherly role of the bishop and the wider episcopal role of the bishop, the role of national level of episcopal conferences in the whole, all of those are still important questions. So there are massively important questions which are not simply about the level of the parish, but so much of this is simply about the living of parish life well and the enabling functions that enable that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually Jane Crone picks up a really important bit that we haven't covered so far, which is the comment in the synthesis about the need to involve the clergy more actively in this process. And you know, she's asking, well, what do you think, how can we do this better in England and Wales? How do we involve them more?
So I think that the most silent group, other than some of the most socially marginalised, the most silent group in terms of those who have not spoken freely for themselves in the synod process are priests. Bishops have had slightly more chance to do that, and obviously the synod itself facilitated that, but the most obviously silent group are priests. And one of the things that we need to do is to understand better what that silence is about. And I think it's multi-layered. It's not just about one thing. But unless we come to some understanding of why it is so hard for our clergy to share their honest experience in the visceral and vulnerable way that so many lay people did through the synod process, then it will be very difficult for synodality to take root. We cannot do it without the clergy. We need our priests, but we also need to understand why this process feels either exhausting, challenging, an imposition, manipulative, all the different ways in which there are very different reasons why we know that priests have not in some contexts involved themselves. And we should say very clearly, there are many priests who have involved themselves in deeply creative ways. But as a group, the most silent group are the clergy. And it is frankly extremely concerning if we want synodality to be something which is more characteristic of our collective life.
Yeah, I mean we had priest listening groups and a deacon listening group in our diocese, and I think that kind of gave them the opportunity to speak freely between themselves. I do get how you know that they are very vulnerable in a parish group if the parish decides to dump on them, or if individuals decide to just have a go over individual things. That does make it very difficult. You know, they're in quite a difficult position, really. And even
And
as
some priests didn't, I think, they actively wanted, almost as an act of justice and care, to step back and not speak, so that it gave permission to their laity to speak, because they thought if they spoke, then actually it would kind of close down the space. So sometimes it was an act of generosity. Sometimes it was, I think, that there wasn't a sense of trust or safety in being able to do that. Sometimes there was a sense of cynicism. Sometimes there was just a sense of just overwhelming exhaustion, and sometimes a sense that in fact this was the wrong priority, or that there was an agenda that was coming with synodality, which was one that they should be actively suspicious of for various ecclesiological reasons. And all of those things need to be engaged with in a really honest way. That requires the leadership of bishops. It requires a certain inner freedom from our clergy to choose this actively as a path, to will it for themselves spiritually and for the church. And it requires lay people to be understanding of some of the complex realities that our clergy live with, that they don't always feel able to share with us.
Absolutely. And I mean, kind of even as a member of diocesan staff, you were aware that when you were sitting with a small group, you know, like that people were listening to what you were saying. And I very often, as a facilitator, won't say anything at all, because it's not about me, it's about the group. And I think probably the only really real conversation I had was with the group. We'd had a synodal conversation with a bottle of wine with some friends around at my house. And that was probably the most, you know, sort of free I felt to kind of get involved. So I can see that, you know, there was I think we do need to get beyond those polarizing, you know, and everything feeling very freighted, and to build up trust where people can have honest conversations and feel that that's actually not just going to land a whole load of work on them, but that actually that it enlivens them rather than deadens them, being able to take part in that way. It's the whole.
And also that there doesn't need to be this distance. I mean, a couple of bishops said to me, again, anonymously, and these are not England and Wales bishops, this is in a global context, that they had read the reports from their own diocese and within their own National Bishops' Conference groupings, and they had been devastated at the sense of distance between themselves as bishops and the lives of their people. And they hadn't realised on what scale there seemed to be a gap of that kind, and that they had found that quite distressing. I think also reading some of the Synod reports in some contexts has felt quite sort of spiritually overwhelming for some clergy and bishops. Again, one bishop said to me basically that he felt that he should sack himself, having read and that's not the aim of and actually there was something moved. That wasn't just a sort of, oh, I feel really, it was a really important sense that there were all sorts of things he was hearing for the first time that had not been given voice to elsewhere, and that he'd come to a kind of new and quite different and urgent understanding of some of the challenges in his own diocese. So, that this can be quite a confronting and challenging process as well for people, and I think we can't underestimate that.
No, I was at a group of people kind of talking about this process across different countries, and we put all these, what could be the obstacles of synodality? We put all this stuff on the wall. I just thought, oh my gosh, that is everything that we're worried about as a church. There was issues of power, there was issues of trust, there was issues of fear, there was fear of if we did things, there was fear if we didn't do things, and it was like looking at some sort of migraine inducing kind of vision of the future. It was awful. And I think it has the opportunity to express everything has meant that everything has been expressed. I mean, certainly reading through our diocesan responses, there was really dark things that came out. Not from a disclosure perspective, we had a process for that, but just reading like every people's ordinary kind of experiences of church were very harmful in some places, and just having to take that on board and think, gosh, we are a community that harms people as well as that does good. That's a very difficult reality to take on board. You have to kind of get past that, don't you? You have to accept it as who we are before you can then move on to being able to do something productive.
Yeah, indeed.
What Peter Farrell, that's a great comment. One priest I know expressed regret that he'd not had any training in how to be synodal. And I think that's possibly, I mean, so other priests I know have said, could this be co-responsibility? Could this be a way of trying to embody a notion of co-responsibility that we've been grappling with and just haven't got anywhere with because we don't know how to do it? And I wonder if there's something in that, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, one of the perceptions is sometimes that synodality is some technical theory, or it's just a sort of made up nonsense, wishy-washy word. And in fact, it's attempting to describe simply a healthy ecclesial life. That's why the three words of participation, communion, mission were used as kind of guiding theological terms to help us think about what it would mean to be synodal. And at one point, we wanted to almost ban the word synodality because it is unfortunate in all sorts of ways, because it doesn't immediately trip off the tongue. It appears to be something technical or strange or confusing, but it isn't. It's simply about how do we together share a Christian life which emerges from our baptismal calling, in which we are strengthened through confirmation, and where there is a genuine diversity of the pouring out of gifts of the Spirit in a community, so that we are able together to be co-responsible for the sharing of this mission. And that, in a way, it's no more than a reflection on those issues. That then brings up all of those historical legacy issues, and also that remain contemporary now, in terms of the ways in which we're falling short of that vision of a kind of participatory, co-responsible mission with a commitment to genuine communion, not homogeneity, but a genuine life of communion. That brings up the shadows, that brings up the darkness, the failures, etc. But ultimately, that vision is beautiful. Ultimately, that vision is something which is deeply motivational and is what we yearn for. And it's our capacity to really realize that there's no dark arts to it. It's simply a question of how we learn better to live a life which is genuinely interdependent, which understands that we are each dignified, and that the gifts of the Spirit are poured out in the lives of the community as a whole in a diversity of ways and require to be discerned, as it were, together. That that process is one which every priest is trained for, is formed for, and every individual Christian is able to engage in, no matter their experience, no matter their background, no matter their class status, no matter their racial grouping, no matter their gender. That's, you know, it is that inclusive, you know, everyone, of Pope Francis, but understood in a properly differentiated and held way. And where the structures that we have, the structures, and we are a church that believes in structures, in forms of hierarchy, of order, and so forth, those things are there to support and give life to that life, to be enabling of that mission, not the other way around. And that understanding how our structures are serving that mission and reflecting on those together, that's something that we simply have to do if we want to carry a form of life-giving church into the next generation. It's urgent. It's not something that we can sort of come around to gradually when we have time. It's urgent.
Because we cannot make decisions, choices, conversations, plans about the big ticket items, which are also urgent, without having this community life which brings everybody along together. Actually, it's not just that it's not the icing on the cake. It's not, it would be lovely if we could just talk about this. Actually, we cannot progress without learning how to do this together. So
and that's one of the things that October, it took a month for people to learn how to exist together and to share on these questions in a spirit that developed and deepened genuine Christian friendship. Not just the ability to hang out together, but something we can think about as a form of honest Christian friendship. You know, Timothy Ratcliffe talked in the opening reflections, and I think people only took him half seriously at the time. You know, the media is going to be really disappointed. What happens if we come out at the end of this and what we say is we went to Rome and we made some friends? And people treated it as a kind of nice line, but there was deep truth in that. Some of the friendships that were formed across vastly different contexts, people from very different backgrounds, and who would have considered themselves perhaps as people in deep disagreement at the outset. The conditions that led to those friendships are the very conditions that lead to the renewed structure, to the life-giving communities. It's the core of a Christian life that enables mission to be something which has authenticity, and that the world can sense that authenticity, and that it's attractional, that the world wishes to be drawn into that dynamic, to be in that dynamic of Christian friendship. It's relearning the basics of that, not some highfalutin method, but relearning the basics of deep Christian friendship. That's what synodality is at the core. And if that doesn't take root, then it doesn't matter which structures and processes we change, or what new forms of canon law we invent. If we lack that, you know, we're a noisy gong.
Listen, Anna, the hour has flown. It's absolutely flown by. I'm just going to finish up with a final question, just of all that we've talked about. What would be one thing that you would hope that people would take away? You know, sort of the people watching and thinking, gosh, Anna's had like such exposure to all of this that's gone on at this, not at a helicopter level at all, because it's clearly been changing you as you've gone through all of this process. But what could you pass on as a kind of final thought to people who are thinking, I might like to have a go, or I might like to change something, or I might like to, you know, how can I take this synodality a step further?
Well, one of the most obvious things to do, I think, is simply to engage at the most local level. The healthiest level of synodality, I think, is the most local level. And if its heartbeat isn't there, it sort of doesn't matter what we do in Rome in a way. So at the most local level, to find ways to engage with others, to sit, to listen, to pray, to discern, to try to do that work together at the most local level. And that can be done through thinking immediately about the service of others and how the community can be in service of that. But also, I think, simply to take the opportunity to maybe find people who you do not know so well, people with whom you might think you you disagree or don't have much in common, and to try to find a pathway. And the method of conversation the Spirit offers it, but it's not the only method, it's not the only approach. We have centuries of Christian spiritual practice that enable us to do this. But I think at the most local level, to open ourselves to a way of engaging with, encountering, discerning together and praying together, and taking the time to do that, affording this your attention. We give our attention to so many things all the time, increasingly to, endless social media. To what do you give your attention? To whom do you give your time? And how might that be done in a more genuine spirit of Christian friendship, such that the life and the structures of the church might be transformed for our times? But it's simple practices. It's simple gospel practices that allow that to really take root and to happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and that's a great place to leave it, actually, because the next thing that we're going to do as a School for Synodality is to run a few sessions on how to hold those spiritual conversations, because our experience has been that it's simple to describe but not so easy in practice always. And so we want to cover some of the things like, how where has this come from? What's the history? What are the values of spiritual conversation? What are the tips and tricks and practices as somebody who might hold those conversations, as a facilitator or a listener of those conversations, that will help you to make them go well and to just to make them run smoothly? And there's a few things that we've picked up over the last couple of years which will help with that. And then how to get going in your own community. Anna, as Anna says, anybody can hold a spiritual conversation. You do not need training, but if you feel that might be helpful to you, these are sessions starting, I think, the 21st of January, and certainly we'll be sending out more information about that. I know we've had a really good response so far. So if you do want to do that, let us know as soon as possible, because then we can make good provision for everybody. So Anna, I just want to thank you so much for finishing up our series in style. I think when I said to set out on this in September, I said to Chris, why on earth are we having 8 sessions on this? Are there 8 different evenings that we can spend talking about synodality? And actually there have been, and you have given us this a UK and global perspective this evening, which just sort of brings it all together beautifully. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everybody who's been listening and watching along with us. We've loved hearing from you. Do drop us a line if you want to get involved with the School for Synodality, and there are lots of resources on our website, so have a poke around in there and see what you can find. And good night everybody, and God bless. Bye bye.